Chainsaws are great tools, but only when they work. But of course, sometimes they don't work, which is the case with this one. The fix can range from a minor inconvenience to major work taking some time. This one unfortunately is not an easy one, but it's also not the worst either. But as you're about to see, it's something you should be able to do, especially if you don't want to spend money to have someone else fix it. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at this Poland chainsaw. And the problem is that it won't start, but the reason why is a very common one, because the fuel system needs serious attention. So you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but if I had to guess, this one has not seen the best care. I know it's not a commercial grade machine, but with some care, it should last long enough to be worth it. I do have to admit, the engine is still putting up a good fight though. That's when we find our first of many problems with this machine, and that is a broken purge bulb. The strange part was that after opening the fuel cap, there was still fuel in there. So you can start an engine with the broken purge bulb, but it could take several pulls before it'll try and start. Next, we'll look at the fuel lines and see just how bad they are. And what we find is very common for a lot of chainsaws, which are broken fuel lines. The reason why there's a pool of fuel here is because we had the saw on inside. So it's probably a good idea to pour out the fuel and also examine its condition. And just as we thought, the fuel was fresh, meaning they must have poured it in pretty recently. Now fortunately for us, the fuel filter was still connected to the fuel line, which is pretty amazing considering that all the other lines were missing. So this is a huge problem, and the reason why is because we have no idea how the fuel lines are supposed to be ran. So unless you have another chainsaw to look at, you might have to look up photos or videos to help out. But if you're not able to do that, you might want to consider asking a friend for help instead. And of course, like most chainsaws you find, this one was covered in dirt and oil. So just for cleanliness and filming, we'll quickly give it a spray and rinse. Of course, you don't need to do this, but it is much nicer to work on a machine that's not covered in grossness. Once we're done spraying it down, you can either wait until it dries off or tear into it just the way it is. Now the first item I want to look at is the purge bulb. And that means we'll need to take off the recoil to get a good look at it. But unfortunately, after getting the cover off, turns out it snaps into place and is not surface mounted. So to free it, we'll need to release the tabs holding it in place from behind. But of course, we need to get to the carb and fuel lines anyway, so this was kind of expected. Also, the airbox on this machine didn't want to come off easily and needed a bit of persuasion. So here comes the hard part, which is trying to figure out where all the fuel lines go. So this port on the side of the carb will connect to the short port on the bulb. And the long port on the bulb will lead back to the opening on the far right side of the fuel tank. That only leaves us with the opening on the left side, which will connect to the port on the right side of the carb. It is a bit tough to visualize, so we'll take our time running the lines. Next, we'll take the carb off the engine, which will give us a lot more room to work. Now if yours isn't as bad as this one, you might not need to take it off. But I could only guess that you might be replacing one line instead of all of them. But I will tell you, partial line changes never end the way you want them to. And with the carb out of the way, we'll start by pushing out any leftover fuel lines from the openings. And that allows us the chance to see what's left of the old fuel lines, and what we see is pretty rough. The old lines are extremely soft and we're just barely hanging on. In fact, there's a really good possibility that these might be the original lines. There's also another surprise for us. Turns out the openings in the fuel tank are different sizes. My screwdriver fits in this opening, but it didn't fit in the other one. That means we need to use two different fuel line sizes for this system. I'm also choosing not to install the plastic splice and instead opt for a longer return line. And since the opening on the fuel tank is smaller on the left side, it means the fuel filter will be the smaller line. And of course the return line will be the larger line. Then I'll use a screwdriver to release the tabs on the bulb and it should come right out. So if by chance you have a spare bulb lying around, you might be able to take this one apart and rebuild it. However, it might not be worth doing it because these are not that expensive. But if you have more time than money, it might be worth rebuilding them. So we don't want to install the bulb just yet, and that's because it'll make connecting the fuel lines a bit harder. And instead, we'll run the line out of the openings and connect the lines right before installing the bulb. So the first line I'll be installing will be the larger fuel return line. Cutting the end at an angle will help you to get it into the opening before pulling what you want into it. And as you can see, there's just enough line in the tank to grab it with some pliers. Now for this one, all we want is at least an inch of line into the fuel tank. That way it's very unlikely that it will come loose and back out of the opening. We'll then cut the end of the return line about an inch past the opening for the bulb. We'll then repeat the installation process for the smaller fuel line and run the filter line into the fuel tank. The difference this time is that the line needs to be quite long so we can install the fuel filter. And don't worry if you make it too long because you can always just pull out the extra line. Don't forget, you'll need to cut off the part that was cut at an angle, that way you can install the filter. I'm going to reuse the old filter, but don't be afraid to buy a new one if you think yours is bad. And the last item is to make sure there's plenty of fuel line in the tank, that way the filter will sit at the bottom of the tank so it can pick up all the fuel. So the fuel lines have all been ran and we should be able to install the carb. However, this would be a great time to at least inspect its condition. The round inlet screen does have some light debris on it, but it's not terrible. The pumping diaphragm is also in great condition, which leads me to think that this carb is in working condition. That only leaves us with a very important metering diaphragm to inspect, because if this part fails, so does the carb. So on first impression, it looks good. However, if you try to work the diaphragm, you'll notice something strange. The diaphragm wants to stay in only 2 positions, which is not what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to rest in a neutral position in the middle, and since it's not, we'll need to replace it. So if you have more time than money, or they don't carry your diaphragm anymore, you might want to consider trying to rejuvenate it. And the last thing I want to do to the carb is a flow test. I'm going to fill the pocket for the screen with carb cleaner and then press on the rocker arm on the other side. I'll then wait for the cleaner to disappear from the pocket, which ours does. Now if your carb cleaner doesn't disappear from the pocket, then you'll have to clean the screen until it does. If you noticed, I didn't do any serious cleaning on this carb, and that's because it didn't need it. But if we had opened the carb and it looked pretty bad, then yes, I probably would have put it into the ultrasonic cleaner. So now that we serviced this carb, we can finally install it, but because this engine has a separate purge bulb from the carb, we'll need to install a short piece of fuel line. This line will then go to the opening for the bulb and connect to the short port on it. So right now I'm figuring out where to cut the fuel lines, that way they're not too long. And once the lines have been cut close to where they need to be, we'll then slide the carb off and connect the fuel filter line. We'll then slide it back onto the studs and then deal with the purge bulb. I do it this way because I have accidentally installed the carb before attaching this line. So the fuel line that goes back to the tank will connect to the long port on the purge bulb. That only leaves us with the extra fuel line from the carb connecting to the short port on the bulb. And once that fuel line has been connected, we can now finally snap it into place. Now don't worry, when I show how the fuel flows through the system, it should make more sense on how the lines are ran. Now this is the worst case scenario when it comes to fuel systems. And the only thing worse would be if the carb was missing as well. Now if you only have one broken line, you'll still get to see how the fuel lines are supposed to be ran. Also, these carbs are known for choke issues, so make sure it works like it should before continuing. You don't need a lot of fuel when doing a flow test, but half a tank should be good enough. So when pressing on the purge bulb, fuel will come up the filter line, flow into the carb, then leave on the left side, then go into the bulb, partially filling it, and then leave and go back to the fuel tank. And as you can see, fuel is flowing just like it should be, which means we can finally finish with the reassembly. So how did this mess happen with the fuel lines and the purge bulb? Well, if I had to guess, the answer is a bit complex. First off, I think they used the wrong gasoline to mix their oil with. The second cause would be prolonged exposure to that gasoline. Using bad gasoline for a short time isn't terrible, but having it in the system for months isn't going to do you any favors. So if you can't find good gasoline to make your fuel with, then I might recommend that you empty the fuel system between uses. Yes, that is tedious, and that's a very good reason to choose good gasoline to begin with. You can avoid a lot of headaches if you want to. Unfortunately, most consumers just choose to do it the hard way. So luckily for us, it started and ran without any real issues. Next, we'll let it cool down and then we could do another cold start followed by yet another one. So this could have been a lot worse, but fortunately things worked out in our favor, but it's not always going to be this easy. So if I own this chainsaw, I consider taking better care of it, but of course that's from my perspective and not theirs. So my question is, would you say you take good care of your chainsaw, or are you neglecting it just like this person did? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.